My name is Moriba Jah, and I'm an aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where I lead a transdisciplinary research program in space safety, security, and sustainability. And I've partnered with SpaceWatch.global to start a new series of web talks, cafes, space cafes called Moriba's Vox Populi, which is Latin for people's voice. So I hope to see you there. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be candid conversations about all sorts of stuff related to space safety, security, and sustainability. I am a space watcher.
I'm Thorsten Greening, producer, technical hand, and publisher of SpaceWatch Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. We have also opened our fan shop online for you, where you can support us directly and become a Space Watcher. And Moriba, yes, I see the Space Watcher shirt, so I'm happy to see that. Edition 1 has awesome merchandising products for you, your friends, the ones you love, and your support is needed to keep our work alive, and we do that for you. If you have missed any of the previous web talks, we have an archive available on our website in the events section and on YouTube. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to hand over to your host today, Professor Moriba Jah. Moriba, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Thorsten, and thanks, Frank, and everybody here and my guests for this exciting next session of the Space Café, Moriba's Vox Populi, the people's voice. And one of the interesting things is that usually when we do these sessions, sometime after, I try to get a feel for what people might be interested in. And it occurred to me that, the world is becoming more and more involved in space activities and these sorts of things. And, given this activity, I've seen lots of talk about people going back to the moon, having, women go there for the first time. Right now, we have 2 missions that just successfully got to Mars from the UAE and from China. There's Perseverance, a US mission that's going to get there to Mars soon, kind of thing. And we're talking about sending people there. And, when I look at the current state of affairs in, space traffic, all the objects that we're launching, we're tracking about 26,000 or so human-made objects, anthropogenic objects in near-Earth orbit. It's a finite resource because we've put things on very specific kind of orbital highways, and the highways are becoming more congested, more littered. In pandemic terms, we have not flattened the curve on the growth of pollution in space. Part of that because most people are not compliant with what science is saying and these sorts of things. And, taking a page out of, traditional ecological knowledge, things that certain indigenous people of the globe have been looking at for tens of thousands of years. It's like, well, if we have this finite resource and we're all participating in this and people are just making individual behaviors and how they practice stuff, does it make sense to try to come up with norms of behavior that have some sort of ethical foundation to them? When we go to, if people went to Mars right now, like us here, all present in this Space Café, Moriba's Vox Populi, if we all went, what would we see on the Martian surface? Well, we'd find some heat shields, broken heat shields burnt up. We'd find some parachutes flapping in the Martian wind. We'd find some dead rovers. So the thing is, we as a humanity, as we're exploring space, the same kind of thought process and saying, oh, well, I'm going to do this because I can, is that something that makes sense? Is doing things just because it's legal, is that enough? Should we have some sort of ethical considerations? And the other thing too that is very interesting to me when I look at behavior of people in space is that everybody's asking the question, what's normal and what's abnormal in space? What's normal behavior? And there's geopolitical saber rattling. Oh, the Chinese are doing this and Russia's doing this, but India's doing this. And one of the things that occurs to me is that if behavior in humans across the globe has variations depending on where you were born, what you believe, maybe even your faith, your relationship to the universe and existence and creation, if that tends to, for lack of a better term, bias or prejudice your behaviors in any way, why should we expect that behavior in space is just going to be uniform, like that doesn't matter? Of course it matters, and it makes sense too. So today I want to start having a conversation about what role should these beliefs and our faith have in how we as a humanity approach behaving sustainably in space and even exploring life on other celestial spheres. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guests. We have Brother Guy Consolmagno from the Vatican Observatory. We have Harel Ben Ami, delegate of the Israel Space Agency to the United Nations. We have Ari, who's a senior project planning and control analyst at Parker Aerospace. We have Hdeel. She's a professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University. We have Andreas, who's faculty of theology at University of Bern. So I want to just open that up. Do any of you have anything to kind of say with what I just said as an opening statement?
Well, let me jump right in because being at the Vatican, the one unique thing about the Catholic Church is that we happen to also be our own nation. And this puts us at the Vatican City State in a place of unique opportunity because traditionally it has been a place where other diplomats get together and negotiate before they're willing to negotiate in public. There was a meeting of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. I bet you didn't even know such a thing existed. It's headquartered in Vienna, and they had a 50th anniversary meeting on the peaceful uses of space following the 50th anniversary of the Space Treaty. Before that meeting, they came to us to hold a workshop on basically a select 30 people or so in the same room, just talking about what are the issues and what are the things we have to worry about. And as the host of that workshop, I got to hear what the other people were doing. The thing that really came out strong to me, and I think this is a theme that we're going to all come from regardless of our faith and regardless of our tradition, is that rules and laws work only when everybody agrees ahead of time that we need them. You can, announce the most grandiose set of rules in the world, but if nobody follows them, then they're worse than useless. And the reason to get people to obey laws is because everyone can see at the end of the day, it's in everybody's interest to do that. So we had some industrialists who were, planning on using space for profit. And they said, we cannot get people to invest in our company if there's the threat that after we've figured out how to mine an asteroid, somebody else steals the minerals we send back. Or even if it's not minerals we're sending back, even if it's just data we're sending back, we have to figure out a way that we can send back clean data that is worth being able to sell to somebody. And I'll end with your example of going to Mars. Not only are we going to see human trash the first time we go to Mars, but the next people who go to Mars might also find Mars littered with E. coli and all the other germs that we left behind, which would ruin the science of trying to find out, did Mars come up with life on its own?
I like that. Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to chime in?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in and also pick up on a point that was just made by Brother Guy. In terms of your setup, Moriba, from the Islamic perspective, and I come at this as a lawyer, so I'm a lawyer and I also teach transactional Islamic law. And, you know, in thinking about this discussion, I looked at some decisions that have come down, legal opinions that have come down from a multilateral body on Islamic law, contemporary decisions, looking at issues like human cloning and in vitro fertilization, etc. And one of the texts comes to mind listening to this beginning of the discussion where, and I'm going to quote here, on human cloning, the legal opinion says, Islam does not set up any obstacle or obstruction to the freedom of scientific research that constitutes a means to discover the order established by God in his creation. And this is the key point. Nevertheless, Islam stresses that the door cannot be left wide open without restriction to the generalized implementation without limit of the results of scientific research without examining them closely for legal reasons, and also considering the public benefit and the public impact. And I think the points that you've raised go to the issue of, you know, there are multiple issues here when we talk about space activity. The permissibility of engaging in it, who gets to do it, what are the implications for others, do we need an ethical code, do we need a moral code, a legal code, I should say. And so that, I think, speaks to, as I understand it, the Islamic approach in terms of some fundamental questions that arise that we work from, but also on this point of commercial activity that was raised. And we needing to agree that there be some kind of code so that people comply. I think there is an additional question, which is, at what point does that agreement need to happen? Do we have commercial actors taking steps without being governed by any agreed upon rules or rules of the road, and they then drive what comes next simply because they've done it? Or is it necessary to get moving on some kind of framework before these commercial activities, and someone goes and mines, you know, resources in space and then has some kind of a right to assert? And that, I think, then colors what happens in the future simply because it's happened. So interesting setup, and I think there's a lot to discuss here.
Thank you, Hdeel. Ari, you were going to say something?
I think that Brother Guy and Hdeel have made great points. I think at the center of it all, from the business perspective, you have to have buy-in, not just from everyone who decides to leave planet and colonize these other planets, but you have to have an agreement as to the approach. From the Buddhist perspective, we understand that life does not begin and end in this lifetime. There is another life that comes after us, and it's our duty to plant seeds for a life and a generation that we may never live to see. So leaving Mars irresponsibly and littering it with trash and with broken heat shields is the last thing that we want to do to promote some sort of sustainable future for not only our generation, but for the people who come after us in this life or the next, as ourselves in the next life in a karmic cycle, or people we may yet to become. So I do agree that there needs, from the business perspective, there needs to be buy-in, not only from everyone from every different nation that decides to leave Earth, but theologically speaking, I think that religion and humanity is one. You cannot have one without the other. It is inherently a part of who we are. I don't want to, I hate to be a pessimist, but I'm afraid that it will take some sort of disaster, and I hope it doesn't come to this, that would unify mankind as one to seek out this type of peace. Because rarely do people initiate out of their own accord, let's get together and shake on it. For all intents and purposes, if you look at just how the rest of the world was colonized before it became, modernized, it's whoever gets there first sets the rules. And what I'm afraid of are the people who leave Earth and get there first, say, guess what, I'm here, this is our language, this is our religion, and all of you do not have permission to enter. And that's what I'm afraid of, is that it will take some sort of disaster or unfortunate event to unify us, to say, no, this isn't the correct approach. It's not first come, first serve. It's more about us as a species. We are one race and we are one entity trying to better promote our existence in this universe.
I thank you for that a lot. And in fact, I have some things that I want to follow up on with respect to that. But I want to let Andreas and Harel say something if they'd like.
Yeah, I think sustainability in space as well, and combined with Earth sustainability, is key to live on. My motivation for this is to think about the integrity of creation, this idea of the World Council of Churches, that we need to be stewards of Earth, and not only of Earth, but also of the heavens somewhat. This is somehow missed out in the tradition, and that's why I think it's important to think, if in my tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, people believe that God created the heavens and the earth, it's the heavens and the earth. And now we move into the heavens, we need to think about how to do this in a way that we can actually live and prosper long term on. And yeah, our time on earth is finite. We know that from science. It's of course still a lot of time, but yeah, we need to think about where to move.
Thank you, Andreas. Harel, you're muted.
Thank you. I have to say I'm so glad to hear you all, because I understand that there's so much alike in all ways of thinking, all these ways of thinking from different religions. In general, I can say that from Jewish perspective, everything is God's creation, and we're obligated to believe, but also to learn and understand God's creation. And going out to space, the way I see it, is part of trying to understand God's creation. But there's a phrase in Jewish religion called kavod lamakom, which means respect to the place. And makom also means God. So hamakom means God. So in a way, what I'm saying is that we always have to act in a noble way wherever we go. If you go to Mars, we have to be noble at the way we respect the place, the makom, which is, as I said, God. So we have to learn how to create laws that everybody will agree upon, and also act according to these rules. This is the way I see it.
Thank you very much, Harel. You know, one thing, so I'm very happy with everybody's initial input into this conversation. You know, one of the things that I was mentioning to folks just on a meeting yesterday or day before yesterday is, you know, companies are doing things that are legal, right? We have outer space treaty, use of space for peaceful purposes, kind of whatever that means, and you know, free and unhindered use of space as long as there's no harmful interference, whatever harmful interference might mean. And so, you know, the thing that I've been saying is it would be nice if there could be kind of an inclusive dialogue where if, you know, Acme Incorporated from this culture wants to launch some stuff or do something, like part of the licensing process of countries would have to go through some international body where it's not like the international body would be this complete veto power, but at least would be able to provide an opinion in that licensing process to launch, where that international body would include your perspectives from each one of these beliefs and faiths and cultures, right? It's like, yeah, you want to send blah, blah, blah to Mars. Well, from our perspective, we would welcome being able to do this in this way or taking these things into consideration. So I guess the question that I have to you is, do you feel that there is a place for your own, faith-based, belief-based, cultural-based opinions in a regulatory framework that people have to go through before they just go out to space and do stuff?
Do you speak on the terms that you have to meet a certain religious or cultural criteria in order to be entered into the framework, or is it more just it would be nice, it's a wish list, but it would be nice if we had X, Y, and Z persons included in the framework?
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that part of giving folks, I guess, I don't want to use the word, but I'm going to just use it here because I can't find a better one, permission. Before people have permission to send people to the moon or to Mars or to do this, that, or the other, or to mine asteroids, that there would be some international body that would comprise folks such as yourselves that would get to have an opinion about these activities before these people are able to go, so that there's some sort of inclusivity in these sorts of activities, to be viewed less of a constraint. I mean, people usually, whenever I have these conversations, some people are, oh, well, I don't want somebody from across the globe to try to limit what I can do. People keep on thinking of it as a constraint, almost like you're trying to enslave me to these sorts of, and it's like, that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to say, look, we realize that exploration and these activities are critical. They should happen, they have to happen, but the manner in which they happen, we'd like that to have more of a global perspective and how that happens versus very individualized kind of stuff. So what do you feel about that?
I'd point out that the UN is an obvious place to do this, because your inclusivity is not only the 20 or so entities that are capable of launching into space now. There are, I believe, like 90 of the member nations of the UN have space agencies. Even if they're not launching things, they may have university students who are building things, or for sure, they have people who are using the products of space. The biggest economic part of space right now is not mining minerals, it's mining data. And so if you're in Kenya, it's good to have a satellite that can tell you where the resources are, where the illegal timbering is happening. You can find that from space, and Kenya's not going to launch its satellite to do that. Somebody's already got one. So that means that the stakeholders are quite large. The thing that comes, I think, out of our religious tradition is the recognition, to use Catholic terms, we are all sinners, but that shouldn't stop us from doing what needs to be done. That we shouldn't have that stand in the way of doing what we're doing. We can't exploit space if everybody's the lone cowboy and there are no rules, because eventually, no one's going to invest in my company if there isn't some assurance. And in some ways, what is needed, this goes back, I think, to what Ari was saying, is not even a rule that these are good and these are bad, but we're all going to agree that red means stop and green means go. It might be arbitrary, it might not even be optimal, but as long as we all agree to work under the same rules, then it's like playing a game. We have the referees who can say that this was, or was it against the rule, but you can't play basketball without rules. Where's the three-point line or whatever? And I think what all of us here are representing are traditions that have been more than one nation have actually dealt with, not just more than one culture on Earth, but more than one culture over time. Because each of us, are very long-lived religions that have seen lots of changes in culture. And there is an example of one place that does work so far, which is Antarctica, and the scientific use of Antarctica. I think, fortunately, because there's no oil in Antarctica, but, it helps that we can have examples of the kinds of agreements that do work.
Excellent. I love that. Anybody else would like to chime in?
I'd like to chime in to Brother Guy there about Antarctica. The whole reason I think that it works so well up there is because survival is very much interdependent on one another's trust and mutual respect. So in a similar way that space is also an equally treacherous and unknown part of the universe that has not yet been explored, I think that one of the reasons why the International Space Station came together so quickly was because multiple countries agreed this is something that needs to happen. And so in terms of international framework, I think that space is as, if not more, treacherous than Antarctica. If you were to talk about a unifying event, the treachery and danger of being alone in space and not having someone to reach out to and flip a red flag of I need help or SOS would probably be an excellent reason and motivation for creating some sort of international framework and interfaith framework for, all right, we're all out here, get along, and not necessarily ask for permission, mommy, may I please leave planet, but more just please be respectful and leave the space cleaner than you did before you inhabited it.
Yeah, and I'd like to come back a bit to kind of with the earlier point that I made from the Islamic perspective. I think the question here also is not just who has the capability to do it, but we need to know in advance or early what is the consequence of doing it. And what then is, say, the perspective from a religion or from a legal system or socially on the consequence of that? And is there information sufficient to address that in a meaningful way? That's for the scientists. But on that point, I would add another issue, which is a practical issue and can have some religious dimensions as well, which is the issue of information asymmetry. If we have commercial actors having these plans, they know what they can do in space, they have analyzed it, or if we have non-commercial actors, the public at large does not have this information. Now, the public at large does not have to have information about everything that happens. That's not the way law or rules or commercial activities generally regulated. But here, this is a common resource, one could argue. Space is a common resource. And I'll tell you from the Islamic legal perspective, that is a question that arises when we talk about resources like the rain, like rivers, that are public and incapable of ownership absent certain circumstances. And then there's a question as to who is capable of giving an ownership right or a property right in something. So in some ways, it seems that the conversation, generally speaking, outside of those who are in the know, and very much in the know, I don't know that the circumstances are ripe for conversation as far as kind of knowledge sharing is concerned, and maybe that too should be a priority to deal with the information asymmetry. And if we talk about, by the way, a body like the UN, which I think is an interesting point, there's a question there too as to what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with a General Assembly type UN system where we have all nations represented? Or are we dealing with a UN Security Council type situation where we have a concentration of authority? So, all very interesting questions, but I'd like to know not only who is capable of space activity, but what will they do there and what are the consequences for people around the world at large?
If I may say something, I do think also that the United Nations and world religions should interact more closely. But I think the way world religions can take an influence is more on the conscience of people. That can be very profound. And maybe sorts of an ethical council could be established. I don't know. But coming back to your idea, Moriba, maybe in relation to the Parliament of the World Religions, I don't know. Something that raises a voice and a concern that maybe will be heard by individual actors and decision makers. So that could have an impact, maybe.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that, but I want to hear from, see if Harel has something.
Well, I'd like to say that it will really be nice if COPUS, the Committee of Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, will create one session where they will listen to people from different religions. But I'm not sure they would really agree about that.
Oh, you don't know, man. I mean, so I mean, look, people. When I suggested having this Space Cafe, some people were like, "Wow, man, you're kind of crazy to even want to have this sort of discussion," and you know, leave it to you, Moriba, to want to talk about this stuff, you know, because it's like a bit uncomfortable in these sorts of things. But I have to say this, right? So we have one of the things that I think we can already see being asked, and I hadn't really thought about this, but it makes sense now, is that, you know, in part of this whole space sustainability kind of thing that we've been talking about, one of the things that I've been very intent on is trying to figure out, how do we enroll humanity in this vision? How does this conversation about space go beyond just astronaut groupies, people who love Elon and all this other stuff? How do we go beyond that? It's like there's this sort of infatuation with space. There's this sort of elitism in space. Oh, you know, if you don't have a PhD, you can't possibly understand because it's too complicated. Whereas for me, it's like, look, we don't idolize people that are captains of boats. We don't idolize pilots. Like I don't personally, I don't think we should be sensationalizing or idolizing space. We should view it as a natural extension of humanity's involvement and experience in existence. And so how do we enroll humanity in this vision? And I think it makes a lot of sense to purposefully go to religious leaders, engage them and say, space is not something that you should be absent from. Space is not something separate to the things that you should care about. Let's bring you into this conversation because you lead a large group of people and influence their daily activities. And the way to enroll humanity in this vision isn't just by having these conversation webcasts and YouTube stuff. It's actually going to the people of these different cultures and faiths and having this candid conversation and saying, you're part of this, and welcoming them and making it difficult for them not to participate, in my opinion. So I actually will probably contact Simonetta, the people at UN-USA, and say, we should seriously consider having people of different faiths, having a faith-based, religious-based conversation within UN-USA, and even having, like you said, maybe a panel of these folks that are frequent participants in the activities of UN-USA. So for sure, I'm going to contact Simonetta just as a result of this discussion already. So I thank you for that. But any thoughts about what I just said?
And one small point in terms of contacting and how I think the Ethics Council idea is fantastic. We've seen religious groups cooperate on climate change, for example. We've seen the Pope speak about climate change and the environment, yes. So there is a place for that in the public square outside of a particular tradition and within one. But one thing I'd want to say, from my own experience in my classroom, for example, again, I teach transactional Islamic law. And what students are often surprised to learn is that there are many Islamic forerunners to what we understand to be the common law of contracts, for example. And so there is a lot of foundational similarity, if not basis, in the Sharia, which is Islamic law, for principles that we take as being secular and civil law principles. And there are probably other religious bases for that as well. You know, again, I mentioned early on, I was looking at some opinions on scientific issues from a particular body, the Islamic Fiqh Academy. And, you know, I was looking at an opinion on doctor-patient privilege, where the Academy found that there's a religious basis for that. But we think about that in terms of HIPAA, for example, in the United States. My point is that if there is a way to not have a barrier that may be unnecessary between the religious and the secular, then that would perhaps be one approach to accomplishing that dialogue. We can call it an ethics dialogue. And certainly not to proselytize here, but I do think in practice there are not these clear lines between religious and civil when we speak of the law in particular.
Thanks, Hdeel. Anybody else like to chime in? Ari?
I'd say that it would be an ingenious idea to approach religious leaders about the promotion of space for every man, space for the common man. Get interested, get excited about space because we're a part of it. The only thing that a small problem that I would at least foresee with regard to Buddhism is that unfortunately religion and politics kind of go hand in hand. I know that anything that would come from the Dalai Lama would be scrutinized heavily by media, either by the Chinese government or other more extremist governments, as propaganda. And then there's always that underhanded, why are you promoting this, sir? And even though our intention, of course, comes from a place of understanding and truth and love, I think, at least from a Buddhist perspective, the idea is to do as much as you can within your immediate sphere of influence. That's why there's this dichotomy of, yes, promote good and love and understanding and the best you can to achieve enlightenment in this life in your immediate area. But there's also that dichotomy of like, well, are you really going out of your way to create more junk outside of your immediate sphere of influence? And you're telling a religious leader to go out and promote junk off planet. So it's just, it's this weird do good, but not too much good to the point where it's detrimental. And also religious leaders are always going to be like, well, what is your, why are you getting involved in this? What's your game? What is the end game of this? You know?
Interesting. Andreas, Harel, or Brother Guy?
Well, one thing that any kind of regulations or rules that we even agree with, there's also the problem of how do you enforce them? And for those of us who come from a more structural religion, we have a long history of doing it badly. And, you know, we can warn people this doesn't work, though we're still trying to learn what does work. But it really does come from a sense of, I think the first step is raising awareness and raising awareness among leaders. Sometimes it's best done behind closed doors because, as Ari says, this is where, you know, if you're not doing it to just show off, look how wonderful I am, then maybe you'll be paid attention to more. An avenue that comes to my mind that I have been thinking about using is the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which has over the years promoted the idea that the fear of nuclear winter, which I think actually had a long-term effect on how people understood nuclear arms. They've been very strong in the environment, which eventually I think affected the Pope's writings on the environment. And other activities like that can, you know, raise the conversation. And also to make it seem less far out there, because I think most people still see life in space as being science fictional.
Yeah.
A nice place to start might just be religious activity on light pollution. Something that we're all doing, something that we're all guilty of. As much as I rail about light pollution, some of the biggest light polluters in cities are cathedrals that have big spotlights on them so they can look pretty, which drives me nuts. Pope Benedict had a wonderful phrase in a sermon 8 years ago, and I'm talking about light and dark, where he said, light pollution is a symbol of human sinfulness because it's blotting out God's faint lights with our own bright lights. And an interesting way of attacking it.
Absolutely. Andreas?
Well, I think we have the opportunity to be, for once, when we think about space, to be more or less ahead of the problems. Oh, there are already big problems rising, but we have the chance to develop into space in a sustainable manner. That's why I think this is important to talk about this and to influence the discussions and the guidelines and the developments of legal regulations and things. But one other thing that haunts me a bit is that there's maybe a problem that we have like a space bubble where we talk a lot about space, which is important, and I participate in that obviously, but we also need to connect it to the earthly affairs. And this is something that still needs to be done more, I think. It needs to be, when UNOSA is working on it with the Space for SDGs and things like that, but I think there needs to be more integral discussion about what comes next and how does this play together. More, well, I would call it a planetary approach.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Harel, did you have anything that you wanted to say, or?
Well, Brother Guy reminded me of something I'd like to say. Well, in some mystical sides of the Jewish religion, like Kabbalah, different streams of Kabbalah, they see the world as a reflection of our inner world. Well, I guess many of you know that. So, in a way, if we pollute space or pollute the world, light pollution, whatever, you could see it as if our inner world is not clean. So I guess the first thing we have to do is clean ourselves or pure ourselves before we go out to space. That's all.
Thank you for that. I want to reach out to Torsten and see if Christian Unfried is around and willing to come up on the stage and join us and ask his question, which seems fairly lengthy, regarding Albert Einstein. Christian?
He has the permission to talk.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
All right. So well, I came across this comparison by Einstein about science versus religion. Science talking about the facts and the things that are there, but not about how the things should be. And on the other hand, saying religion is not connecting facts, but talks about the behavior, basically. When it came to my mind that this is not just science and religion, but when we talk about how things should be in the economic context, we mostly do not think about religion, but we think about lawyers, we think about courts. And now, having remembered also that Hdeel said before, she's a lawyer, I was wondering, how do you see in general in the space exploration context that the relationship between law and jurisdiction versus church and religion?
Yeah, anybody? I'd love to see somebody try to answer that.
One thing I'll talk. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
One thing that I've learned being an American who's then moved to Italy and to the Vatican, that there are two different philosophies of law, which sometimes get confused. And for lack of a better, we could say sort of Northern European, Southern European. Northern European laws are regulations like red means stop, which if you don't follow them precisely, chaos ensues. And in the South, laws are a set of ideals, which nobody is expected to follow perfectly. As you've ever tried driving in Rome, you know what I mean. And yet, it's good to have both sets of laws. It's good to have both ideas as long as you can sort out which are which. I think we need the ideals, even though we know that we're never going to be perfect enough, clean enough inside to follow them. And we also need the regulations so that we know which side of the road we're driving on.
Very interesting perspective. I love that. Anybody else? Hdeel, it seemed like you were going to say something.
Yes. I missed the last part of the question, but I would just say from the perspective of the Islamic perspective or Sharia, it's for Muslims, who are observant, and not all Muslims will be observant or observant in every area, but the Quran, for example, the holy book, is law, and the law governs all aspects of life. And so there is no separation in principle between these things that we're speaking of and the law. But I'll leave it at that, because I unless someone wants to remind me of the rest of the question that was asked, because I was listening to Brother Guy, and I think I missed the last part of the question that was raised. So I want to make sure I'm responding.
No, yeah. Go ahead, Christian.
It's just maybe a little bit. What comes to my mind now is maybe also from my my Christian background. It's I was thinking about that there is the good and the right, and the question is always: is the good always the right, and the right always the good thing to do?
That is a very good question. Thank you.
I mean, not to muddle things here, but then what is the good and the right, and who decides that, and decides it for whom?
And that's especially the question: what is the good and the right for space exploration?
And again, who decides that, and decides it for whom? I mean, who has to bear the consequence of the decision as to what is good and what is right? I think these are questions, I like the earlier point that we have to talk about it as this is something that's happening now. It's not the Jetsons, right? Everyone remembers that cartoon, I'm sure. It's as if, this is something happening in the future. But I don't know that everyone understands that. So again, I come back to this information asymmetry and your point about inclusivity, Moriba, at the outset. But yeah, good, right, and I think even religion, at least from the Islamic perspective, there's not always going to be a perfect outcome in terms of application and enforcement. That's not the goal, but there's the law, and then there's application and adherence, etc. And
part of that is recognizing that we don't know, and we're going to continue to learn, and the situation will continue to change, which is why we can't set up a law and say this is it and we'll follow it all from now on. But we do need an ongoing group of people, whether the UN or someplace else, who will continue to adapt and monitor and make decisions and sometimes get it wrong, and have the opportunity to go back and fix things if they need to. Because we are all sinners, but, we're all still going to try our best.
And I think, I just want to add, I think there needs to be transparency there. Whether or not people are going to follow this or be interested, but there has to be, I think, transparency, because we are dealing with something that is a shared space, that is a shared resource, if we want to call it a resource. And there are impacts for everyone, whether they participate or not, or have interest or not. This is true in different areas, of course. It's not just here. But transparency, I think, is important in addition to the inclusivity piece.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, and Andreas, were you going to say something real quick?
Yeah, just I think we also need to be clear that we need to listen to science when we make law regulations. I mean, we cannot ignore the world around us. I mean, it's probably obvious for anybody here in this discussion, but it's not always obvious out there in the processes of laws are made. Yeah, I think that's just something important for me, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to say thanks, Christian, for that. And
thanks
I
to
know,
you for the answers.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine Courtney is hopefully in the house, and I want to give Catherine, please join us on stage and chime in. What would you like to?
Hi, thanks, Moriba. I mean, I actually think the panel's already discussed this, but if you have any further insights to share, I'd be interested, which is, I know that faith communities have been vital, actually playing a role in encouraging people to respect and protect our planet, and also in tackling social injustices and things like that throughout history. Could be very powerful voices in raising awareness of the need to respect and protect the unique space environment and also to, in a sense, ensure that all humanity can participate, and developing nations, for instance, don't get locked out by the first movers and the big players with the big budgets. So my question was, how can faith leaders become more engaged with all of the issues that are being raised by these disruptive new commercial, civil, and defense developments in space? You know, everybody from Donald Trump to NATO declaring space a war-fighting domain, SpaceX and others willy-nilly putting up satellites without regard for whether that locks everybody else out, and you know the impact that it has in terms of pollution, space junk, etc. So I think you have discussed the role of leaders and how they might be able to be more effective behind closed doors, but I'd just be interested in any other thoughts that you have about how engaging faith communities can help us protect space.
I forget who it was that mentioned it before, but I think it's vital that religious leaders have a duty to remind not only their respective followers, but the world that our influence and our responsibility as humans does not end with Earth's atmosphere. We have a responsibility to the heavens. We have a responsibility beyond our atmosphere. There is that fine line that you have to dance between, you know, you're losing your audience when you say, oh, beyond Earth, and they go, oh, like aliens, and you're like, yes, but also it's not, this isn't 1,000 years away. This is a reality that's going to happen very quickly in probably the next couple of decades. And so to normalize the conversation, I guess, about space as being a part of our responsibility as a human race to give back, to make sure it is safe, to ensure peace and tranquility for generations to come, I think that would probably be what I would think a religious leader's responsibility is just to normalize the conversation and not make it so far-fetched as to you don't have a part of it. It's like, no, you absolutely have a part in it. You may not be able to get a ticket to Mars tomorrow, but you might, or your children might.
Yeah.
Okay.
You go, Hdeel.
I have a very brief point, which is I was going to say that one should consider perhaps the depoliticizing the roles of religious leaders or conversants in the process to the extent that that's possible, so that a person representing a religious perspective is not viewed as an agent of a particular state or of a particular interest, or is not politicized. Now, that's not very clean and easy, but I think that's something that should be borne in mind anytime, frankly, we bring religion or religious figures into a dialogue such as this one.
Yeah, I wanted to reiterate my point that maybe that's important because I come from a Protestant background, and there are large Protestant groups who do not really appreciate scientific findings and somehow make a conflict between science and religion. And this is really bad for our planet, I think. And that's so bad in how I would interpret my religion. So I don't know what the experience of the other faith participants here is. Does this exist in other religions as well? The neglection of science and reality somewhat. For me, this is intertwined. You know, for me, it's how I interpret reality. This is my faith. But sometimes I feel that people leave this. Or do this in a strange way, let's say.
Well, we're political animals and we'll always have that. But my experience, interesting, was in the aughts, this is now 15 years ago, I was elected the president of the Division for Planetary Sciences of the American Astronomical Society, purely secular. And one of our jobs was to go to Washington, D.C., to go to Capitol Hill to see about getting money for space science. And two things that happened. One was a congressman asking us to our face, does anybody here believe in God? And then everybody else sort of laughed and pointed at me. But the more interesting thing was that the congressional committees would have lay staffers where two would be hired by the majority party, one by the minority party. And on the Space Science Committee, the three people continued working regardless of which party was in power, because space was, and I think still is, one of the few things that does not have a really strong political split, that one party is all in favor and the other party is all against. But you can find people strongly in favor or strongly against in both parties. So I find that somewhat hopeful.
I'd like to add something, please.
Yes, please, Harel.
The way I see it, bottom line, all religions want peace. And in my country, religion leaders sometimes have loads of influence about the leaders of the country. And I guess if leaders of all religions would try to influence, if they can, political leaders, to act in a peace way on Earth and in space as well, we could reach like new frontiers. So I believe we could do it. We just have to try to go on with it and lead the way.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Harel. Thanks, Catherine, for coming on and asking your question. I would like to see if Dana Lynn Barnett is around and wants to come on stage and.
Hi, I hope that the kids won't make too much noise here.
That's
I was
okay.
asking, how would you make, because I know this is very nice, but as Ari mentioned, in the end of the day, it's business. And how would you make companies like SpaceX listen and have an incentive when today everybody wants in on the mega constellation and have lots of satellites, and there's no even an international body that consolidates all these plans together, like what happened to Einstein and everything.
Yeah, I'm gonna let people think about that a little bit, but having, being somebody that kind of works, in the space environmentalism, sustainability thing, and having spoken to multiple companies by and large do what's legal. And they're just following a list of, all right, if I want to be able to put so many satellites on orbit, these are the things that I have to do. These are my requirements. Nowhere in any of those requirements is there an inclusive conversation with folks such as the ones that we're talking to today. And so personally, my recommendation is that nation states consider that in part of this process, and again, under the guise of an international organization, maybe it's UN, USA. Look, if people want to launch a satellite, right, they have to go to the ITU to get spectrum allocated. So that's like an international organization that you have to go to, even though it's not of a specific country, to say, yeah, here's your frequency allocation from here to here. There's no reason that we can't have a similar type of model where before people actually put stuff or send people in a space, that you have to go and at least have a conversation about this. Again, it's less of, from my perspective, it's less of permission and more of the idea of stewardship and wanting to have input, recognizing that having input is not a limitation to the ability to go out and do awesome things, right? But actually enhances our humanity in doing such a thing. But anyway, that's my opinion, and I don't want to get in front of the other guests. So if anybody on the guests wants to respond to Dana.
In some ways, I'm afraid it's what Ari was mentioning. We may need a disaster, the collision of some of these satellites before the private owners recognize the need to decide which side of the road we're going to drive on. A part of that is that often it's the investors who will control what the companies will do. But if you have a company that's wholly owned by a multi-billionaire, whether it's Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, they're less responsive to that kind of pressure. And yet, if at the end of the day they want to go public with and sell stock in these companies, then they have to make sure that they follow the laws. Then they have to make sure that they have a sustainable product. And it's comparable to making sure there's enough fish in the sea for everybody to be able to fish.
I just wanted to add to that, thinking about the question, we see increasing movement toward ESG, environmental social governance, and public pressure, whether it's from the consumer or from investors on that front, and companies taking a lead in some cases under public pressure in the spotlight to change behavior here on Earth, right? I think the important point that was made at the end of Brother Guy's comment is about, these entities are out there alone. They don't have investor pressure, and they're not in the public view necessarily. And those who do follow these things think, it's really cool that someone's launching a rocket into space, right? So I don't know that the ESG or the public advocacy aspect that we're seeing now on sustainability, environment, social justice, etc., will transfer into this particular area, certainly not without more education. And then on the other part of this, I think, Moriba, you raised this, but ultimately there is some government approval that occurs and government facilitation for these activities to happen. And so maybe the place to look now is at the government and the facilitators of private activity in space.
I personally think that maybe Elon Musk has good intentions. I think so, actually, but maybe he doesn't recognize all the picture, So, so I think that's why we need to have you, for instance, Moriba, with your work, and others that point to the challenges. I would say, because that's the that's not only sustainability is not only an idea, it's just what's happening. If we don't take care now, we will have a problem later. And I mean, every businessman should take care of this if he wants to think in the long run, And I think this is, at the end, it's not in contrast, but it's just a matter of perspective. If you have a very short-term perspective or a long-term one, and we need a long-term one to survive on this planet and in space.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Dana. I want to bring on Cheryl Gallagher onto the stage.
Thank you. This is, I'm in agreement with most of what is being said here. I find in my experience with working with a really highly multicultural community, that the key to being able to, my question had to do with transcending our sort of inborn tendencies for competition, and how do we reach our, function on our highest potential, our highest, our highest abilities rather than resort to lower abilities. And some of that, I think, is going to grow organically just by the fact that, at least at first, when humanity is actually occupying space, such as we have at the International Space Station, it becomes much more of a tribal, interdependent community. And there's when everybody's relying on everybody else to survive, that encourages an environment of acceptance and respect. And that aspect of mutual respect is probably, when I think about, well, what can we do? We have this discussion is a very clear example of the benefits of that mutual respect. And there are certain commonalities on which we can all agree then maybe building from that foundation of commonalities, which is of course what COPUS is trying to do at the United Nations. When it comes to space, it is completely true that a lot of these companies are just like, well, we're following the laws and there's no law for that, so we can do something. Well, on a certain level, that's true, but the actions that are taken are a bit disrespectful. At the World Space Forum in Vienna a couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussion about people being respectful in space, like with the mega constellations, and there had been a recent near collision and a very between an international, a space agency and a private firm. And the private firm was very cavalier about their attitude about that near collision. And it was based on exactly that point. Well, there was no law, it's, sorry if we concerned you, but, there's no reason, they just felt like no culpability whatsoever. So I'm not sure how on a global level we can get to a place where we can have respectful discourse and encourage that interaction. But I think that's really what's key, because that's the part that's missing the first person that puts up some sort of space, or first entity, not just person, but entity that puts some sort of space defense system or something that could cause hostility against another presence in space, that's going to be a really negative development. So when we're looking at that, there's two aspects. One of them is, how do we achieve that level of mutual respect? And the religious leaders are a key. You pave the way for that kind of respectful discourse if we're coming from this collection of a variety of different backgrounds, and an ability to look at the long view and have a common ground in which to establish that coexistence.
Thank you, Cheryl.
So to summarize, will it bloom out just because of that tribal interdependence of being out there trying to survive? Will there be an aspect of mutual respect such that we can avoid the need for militarization? Although that's a very hopeful thought. I get that. And 3, overcoming that the dynamic of people on Earth, or general humanity, being so wrapped up in their own lives that they, this is a it's difficult to get them to engage. As I mentioned in my comments,
Cheryl,
faith systems have that in common.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go on too long.
We could talk all day, but we just don't have that. But so I appreciate what you said. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to add on to what Cheryl just raised?
Unfortunately, I try not to be a pessimist, but it is what it is. I rarely do larger companies, the billion-dollar companies, do or respect other smaller mom-and-pop satellites out of the goodness of their heart and say, oh, it probably isn't a good idea. It will unfortunately take some sort of near miss or near accident when a billion-dollar satellite is going up that nearly crashes into the maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars satellite for a law to be established. In terms of mutual respect, unfortunately, again, I try not to be a pessimist. I'm all for peace and I am all for love, but it will take some sort of leverage. It will take a respectable presence from 2 or more entities to enter that unknown space for folks to be like, okay, there is at risk of something larger of a negative consequence happening unless we decide to work together. Because otherwise it's just, unfortunately, the big dog who gets there first is going to set the rules.
Thank you for that, Ari. So one of the things that I want people to think about as our session is winding down is this. And let's see what people have to say about this. One of the things that I was thinking about is, once humans make it to Mars and assume that humans settle Mars, and we have the human seed, continues on Mars, and you have people born there that have never and will never visit the Earth. How does our faith, how does religion continue in such a place where, I don't know, are Muslims praying 5 times a Martian day, and which direction are they actually praying in? Right now I can go, well, I have been, right? I've been to the Vatican many times. I've been to Jerusalem, right? I've gone to the Old City. I've gone to these places that I've read about, that I've learned of, and I've connected to the local energy. What does it mean when you have humans that have and never will be able to do that? And how does our faith and how does religion continue under those circumstances? Go.
There's a tremendous literature on that very topic. It's called science fiction. And I say that not glibly. Science fiction is what got me into science. Because one of the great things about science that we do is that we say the laws of physics are the same regardless of what planet you're on, even though the gravity might be different. I think the laws of right and wrong and the laws of the human soul are the same, regardless of where human beings go. And so we will have the same needs, and one of those needs is a system of ways to come up with how we will worship together. One of the great things that came out of the Catholic tradition was the reform of the calendar in 1582. And one of the hidden joys of that reform was that the religious dates are no longer determined by the position of the moon. They're arbitrary. There is a formula that comes close to what a person would see if they're looking for a new moon. But we know the formula isn't exactly right. They knew that when they came up with it, but it was close enough, and it was simple enough that other people could figure out whether you're in North America or in Jerusalem when Easter's going to be. A similar thing will be a way that I think we will all come to a way of coordinating how we worship together and how we come together as a community to deal with a universe that's bigger than any one of us.
Thank you for that. Torsten, how much time do we have, man?
We are over the top of the hour. So
okay.
I mean, but the next hour is coming up, so that's not the issue. But I think as also our audience is obviously on other appointments as well, so we should have a final round, your final thoughts, and then
let's do that. So everybody, final thoughts in this session, which thank you so much for. Final thoughts.
I think that religion and thought and prayer transcends that of our Earth's atmosphere. I think that it's important and it's crucial to remember where we came from and not to discard the blue little marble that we all came from when exploring other planets. And part of the foundational stone for Buddhism, at least for me, is that you plant the seeds of a tree that you will probably never live to see. And that this is an important attitude that we should take not only with religion, but with respect to the environment on Mars when we eventually colonize it.
Andreas, Harel, Hdeel, any final thoughts?
I do think faith shapes us very profoundly, and if it's secular faith or religious faith, doesn't matter for me. It determines our action, and we need to live in a way that we have a future. I think for future generations, for humankind, however you call it. And I think this is a discourse that's very important.
Thank you, Andreas. Harel?
Yes, I'd like to say that I'm I really hope that we will find a way to talk with each other and create peace. I know everybody, like it's obvious, everybody wants that, but I have faith that we will be able to do it eventually. If we find ourselves in a road with peace, we're on the right track. But if we find ourselves on a road with tackles and wars, we're doing something wrong. So basically, we have to ask ourselves all the time if we're doing things the right way, and try to talk with each other and create peace. We have to do it. That's the bottom line.
Thank you. Hdeel?
Yes, well, I'd like to say thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this discussion. It's been nice to, virtually meet everyone. Very interesting. I would say, just working from core principles from the Islamic perspective, the Islamic law perspective, that, there are big questions here. And I think a open, transparent dialogue where there is some more inclusivity is important. Some information sharing is important. There are ethical dimensions. I think we've had some very good recommendations here in terms of how to address them. And I do want to say, you asked how would a Muslim face Mecca from space. The Malaysian government about over 10 years ago put out guidelines for worship in outer space. So they addressed that issue, and it has come up. But thank you all very much, and this has been very interesting. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our guests. This has been a great conversation and discussion, and I'm sure it'll continue offline, and who knows, maybe we'll revisit this again. And thanks, Torsten and Frank. Do you have anything you want to close out with, Torsten?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for this fantastic discussion and giving or creating some more thoughts are in my mind and potentially also in our audience mind. I would just like to announce our next date for the next Moriba Vox Populi, where you see there's a blank spot for the topic. So feel free to reach out to us and make your suggestion what we should talk about. It's the 8th of April, so after the Easter break, or Thursday at the same time. So, and then we have we will continue the discussion you just pointed to. Next Monday we have our first Space Café UAE with Abdallah Al-Wazir, and his guest will be the outstanding Talal Al-Kaisi. And this Space Café will be in Arabic and English to reach out to those that are not in the discussion right now. So those that have an interest in space but can't access it because of the language barrier. So we are on this mission to really go to the regions and speak their languages. On Tuesday, the 16th, my guest in the 33-minute format will be Dr. Jessica West, and you pointed out to the topics earlier. She's from PlugShare project in Canada, and we will talk about norms and behaviors in space, and how far is the just a word, or how that can be turned into action. So what are the rules of the road, and how can we create them? A week later, on the 23rd, I will talk with Nicolas Christophe from the World Economics Forum. He's the head for space and mobility there to talk about their approach. And Moriba, you're engaged in the space sustainability rating, I think, is it? And the space sustainability
absolutely. That's it.
Index. So I would like to hear more from him. And then a week later, I talk with Blaine Curcio, the China space guy, and we're talking about space in China. So also something what for most of us in the Western world is a big secret, somewhere behind a wall. Yeah, a Chinese wall in that case. And I can say that joke, I'm coming from East Berlin, so we had that as well. So, and then on the 4th of March, we start with our first Space Café Germany with the head of DLR, Walter Pelzer, in a dialogue with Andreas Schepers in German. A day later, Space Café Russia with Elina Morozova in, make a guess, yes, it will be in Russian, with her guest Olga Wolinskaya. All these events are online on Eventbrite. I encourage you to sign up for them. As always, we would like to hear your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. And don't forget to sign up for our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. And again, if you like to treat you with something special, become a Space Watcher today. We need your support. Thank you all very much for this very interesting conversation today. I mean, I learned a lot, and I'm honest, I was super nervous, and I was a guy Moriba pointed to earlier saying, should we do that? I said, you can do that. I can't. But I mean, I think it was great, and the respect you all put here into the conversation was really remarkable and wonderful to follow. So I'm very grateful that we have done it, and yeah, Moriba, once again, kudos to you to convince me to do that. Yeah, and then what can I? Yeah.
Peace be with each and every one of you.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll see each other in Copius in a session that Moriba will organize with Simonita.
We will work on that. I mean, I was asked earlier today actually to run our Space Café during the legal subcommittee, the next one. So let's see how we can tune that in. So we keep you informed. Yeah. I hope you all are in the audience and you.
Thank you all.
The panel.
Thank you. Peace be with
you.
Stay
safe,
everyone.
And
thank you, Moriba.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, George.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Stay safe, everyone. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
So nice to meet you.